Welcome to everyone. It is wonderful to see many students from both Carnegie Mellon and Georgetown University joining us for this next conversation with experts on U.S. approaches to advancing democracy and countering authoritarian at home and abroad. If you pick up a newspaper, or better said, if you open your feed, you will be hard pressed to find any moment of the day where these topics are not coming up both at home and abroad. And it's just important that we gather to continue the conversation about what does it mean, what's the role of the United States. So this is our third session, and this one will focus on refreshing the US architecture and alliances, specifically looking at the Summit for Democracy. I want to thank Carnegie Mellon University in particularly Sarah Mendelson for her leadership in pulling together this series. It's been really remarkable, and it's wonderful from the perch where I am now at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University to partner with Sarah and with Carnegie Mellon. So thank you for that leadership. I am delighted to have two dear colleagues and experts on democracy issues with us today. I will introduce them, ask them a number of questions, and then we'll open it up to students. And what we'll do is you can put your questions in the chat box at any point, but certainly once I flag that as an option, and then I will try and get to as many as possible over the course of our hour that we're together. So Ambassador Sarah Mendelson is the Distinguished Service Professor of Public Policy and the head of the Heinz College in Washington, D.C. Served previously as the U.S. representative to the Economic and Social Council at the United Nations, a post that she held until the end of the Obama administration in January 2017. In that role, she was the lead for the U.S. mission to the United Nations on development, human rights, and humanitarian issues, all central to our conversation today. Prior to that, she served as a Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID from 2010 to 2014. Also leading on many of the issues that we'll be talking about today. She served in Moscow at the National Democratic Institute, on the faculty of the Fletcher School at Tufts, and over a decade as a senior advisor and the inaugural director on human rights initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ashely Quarcoo is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. Important that we have all of those pieces together in this conversation. Her research focuses on threats to democracy, social and political polarization, and comparative approaches toward building social cohesion, so important in our conversation today, social cohesion and democratic renewal. She also serves as a senior research manager with the Aspen Institute's Citizenship and American Identity program, and is a visiting fellow with the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. So thank you to both of you for bringing your expertise to our Zoom boxes today. Really looking forward to the conversation. Because our conversation today is on refreshing the US architecture and alliance, I want to start on those two pieces so that we get a baseline of what we're actually talking about. So let me start with you, Sarah, and just ask the question, can you walk us through what is the US architecture for supporting democracy? What does that even mean? Who are the actors, and how is what you and your group have been proposing different? Like, why is change needed? And particularly looking at the recommendation number 2, where you focus on the reform of US approaches to democracy promotion.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your partnership and that of Georgetown University. This has largely been a foreign policy effort, right? The focus has been on democracy promotion outside the United States, and it was very much shaped by the Cold War. This is really beginning in the early 1980s. President Reagan really started it, and a lot of the basic architecture from that era continue to this day. So we're talking about what I would call a supply side effort, right? So congressionally appropriated funds that go to the State Department and USAID. USAID and the State Department are then passing those funds off to mostly US-based NGOs to implement. And the focus has very much been on building institutions, elections, political parties, non-governmental organizations, independent media, rule of law. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it has meant that there needs to be a supplement, right? So more focus on local, more focus on a variety of other issues needs to be supplemented. So for example, we really, even before 2020, I would argue, we needed a refreshed approach to supplement what we were seeing. For a lot of domestic as well as geopolitical reasons, that time has really come. And we're talking about once in a generational effort to reform. So for example, the link between what happens at home and what we do overseas has to be made much more concrete. And I know Ashely's going to be talking about that a little bit. The focus that we had really for many decades was on political and civil rights, and we really downplayed socioeconomic issues. And that was for sure downplaying them at home, but also overseas. That is just no longer possible, particularly as we see democracies around the world really challenged to deliver for their citizens. This has become an issue about the health of citizens, but the health of democracies. This Summit for Democracy, which President Biden announced then as candidate Biden, we think that there's a lot of focus and commitment from the Biden administration to organize this summit, and a lot of what we did in the working group feeding into the task force was create a roadmap of how that summit idea could feed into this new approach, new methods, new themes. And very specifically, really talking about a data-driven, human-centered design approach where local voice is much more critical. Now, that would put us much more closely aligned with I would say a gold standard in global development. A lot of democracy promotion has been a little bit to the side. But it would also change the dominant modalities of how we do this. Now, I don't expect that Congress is going to suddenly stop on a dime from doing earmarks, but working with members of Congress and their staff to understand we could be much more efficient and effective in helping local communities if we were listening and responding much more and using data-driven approaches to do this work. I also think, again, the Cold War approach, which was really focused on political and civil rights, needs to be expanded so that socioeconomic issues are a part of the agenda. And I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Excellent. A lot of different points, which we will tease out over the course of our time together. Ashely, can I turn to you specifically thinking about this question of alliances? Why does it matter? Why are alliances even needed as we're thinking about the United States' effort to support democracy around the world? And what are those alliances that are either exist or could be built?
Thank you, Nicole, and to Sarah, for you both for convening the session, the series, and for inviting me to participate today. It's very good to be here with all of you. So this question of alliances. So I think that we've heard a lot about this, the idea that America is back and that diplomacy is back from the Biden administration as it's come into governance. And I think part of that message that the administration and the President Biden is trying to convey is that we are going to reinvigorate our alliances because they are in fact important, and especially when it comes to our support of democracy. This is the way, in terms of our ability to amplify our norms, our values around the world. We do so in partnership with our other democratic allies when it comes to statements about free and fair elections, in condemning coups such as we've just recently seen in Myanmar, when it comes to advocating and the protection of human rights, in raising concern about the closing space for civil society. Our ability to amplify and elevate those values and norms both sort of in a proactive way as well as in a reactive way, as we see things kind of take place around the world, is critically important that we do so in concert with our allies. And I think this can be particularly important in multilateral settings like the United Nations, like the Human Rights Council. These are places where we not only have places to make statements, but tools that we can use or agendas that can be set. And Sarah had mentioned the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. That's one place where we've seen that kind of alliance of democracies have a real impact when it comes to saying we do need to have an SDG that's focused on this issue of democratic and just societies, and then to sort of take that agenda home and see that it can be implemented. So that's sort of my case, I guess, for our alliances and why they're important, both in those multilateral settings, in our sort of diplomatic efforts when it comes to bilateral relationships and issues, but also in terms of countering these authoritarian forces, which are increasingly dominant around the world, either because they're looking to co-opt the trappings of democracy in order to legitimize a dictatorship or an authoritarian rule. We just saw, for example, the election in Belarus, an election 80% supposed victory, but really just trying to wrap Yushchenko around in the trappings of that election, which we know was not credible. Or when it comes to much more overt authoritarianism, like we see, China and its, exporting of its surveillance systems, which are designed very much around the sort of monitoring citizen activity, including, citizen actions designed to be disloyal. These are all things that we can push back on only or much more effectively when we do so in concert with alliances. And the last thing I'll say about alliances is it's not just a sort of a diplomatic space. I think it's also a sort of assistance space, and this is where I've spent a lot of my career, is in the assistance world for democracy support. And I think that these are opportunities to not only deliver messages and deploy tools and set agendas, but also to sort of create the operational tools, the operational approaches for delivering democracy assistance or for doing democratic governance writ large. And I'll give one example, which is the Open Government Partnership. Sarah, I know, was intimately involved in the creation of that platform, a very unique example of a forum that both brings together governments with members of civil society of their own country to create national action plans around accountability and transparency. But it's also a network across countries for democracies themselves to share their tools, to share their approaches, to share innovations about how they're going about good democratic governance. So it's an alliance. It's not just about lecturing, but also about learning. And I think this particularly is a really important posture for the US to take, given the sort of damage to the US image as a democracy. Another reason why we need to work with allies. Working with partners is about being humble, especially in this moment in our own country, about our shortcomings, about the work we need to do at home, and a realization also, though, that we can't just wait to do that work at home, that we need to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time and be working on both agendas at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Let's turn to the recommendations that your subgroup made. They're obviously, for those who are newer to this lecture series, there's been a task force that's been organized by Freedom House and McCain and CSIS coming together to look at these questions, and each of these subgroups, and in the case of Sarah's subgroup, had a different task to look at, and they came up with a series of recommendations. Maybe Ashely, you can jump in on the first recommendation, specifically looking at this question of agendas that elevate socioeconomic issues and how we think about that. Sarah mentioned this difference between political and civil rights and economic and social rights. What does that look like, and what did the group recommend in this context?
Well, I think, we're coming from a recognition that some of the most critical threats to democracies around the world today are not necessarily those that are posed by our foreign adversaries, but they're really the difficulties that democracies themselves have faced in responding to, policy crises such as, global migration crisis, or the, economic dislocation that came with globalization, the changing nature of work, that's come with corruption in many places, that's also caused kind of domestic crises of democracy. And so there's this, I think, recognition that democracies need to do much better at addressing these domestic governance issues, and also at addressing issues around socioeconomic inequality, in combating corruption, and just generally improving their own legitimacy among their own population. So to Sarah's point, we're not only talking about democracies as kind of the bastions of protecting freedom and political rights and civil liberties, but enacting policies that are ultimately going to make people's lives better. And I think that Sarah's point is that we haven't done a good job of integrating those agendas, of protecting people's freedoms of speech, assembly, et cetera, and also making their making their day-to-day lives better and improving equality. And we're not the only country. We said this sort of, I'm sure, resonates with this audience as we think about the United States, but this is not the only democracy that is is experiencing this kind of divide between not being able to adequately address the economic and social issues at the same time that we're protecting the political and civil issues. These are things that have questions that have plagued allies in Europe and Latin America. These are things that are very, very present in many democracies, because they're global. A lot of these are global phenomena that affect countries around the world. And so we are really, I think, making recommendations that are looking both at the kind of staffing and operational and programmatic interface in the US government that are going to sort of marry more closely our foreign policy work on when it comes to democracy, as well as our domestic work. So I think that's one set of recommendations, which is sort of recognizing that what is domestic is what is sort of the domestic manifestation of this is also a foreign policy manifestation of this, and that we can learn more by having more cross-pollination between those, the foreign policy side and the domestic policy side. So that's everything to do with kind of some of the staffing, how positions in the White House are maybe dual-hatted or have ways to interface, the way that maybe domestic and foreign agencies that normally don't talk to each other should be talking to each other and sharing analysis and sharing approaches and tactics. And so that's one big recommendation. I think another big recommendation I know a later group will talk about as well, which is also just about having more cross-pollination between our democracy agenda and our socioeconomic agenda, to sort of have those align much more closely. Again, that's something that needs to happen domestically, but it also needs to happen on the foreign policy side as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. Sarah, let me turn to you on another one of the recommendations. And you mentioned earlier this summit for democracy and the roadmap that your group pulled together. Can you walk through just some of the process and substance for organizing that substance and your recommendations there?
Sure. Picking up a few threads that Ashely pulled on as well. This issue, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we actually have a framework that the global community agreed to back in 2015 that runs through 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. Why is that helpful in this particular case? Because it applies domestically and internationally. It's a framework for understanding, number one, development happens everywhere. We have gone through decades where we acted as if development only happened somewhere else. This has meant that we have huge gaps and equities in the United States, and this agenda can help us address those. But it also is a understanding of sustainability in the round. Yes, it's about climate, but it's also absolutely about reducing inequality, inequities, tackling the corruption issue. And there is this goal 16 that is really fundamental to the conversation we're having today, profoundly relevant to democracies around the world, prioritizing closing gaps around social justice. And I'll say goal 16 stuck in the end, because there were a number of female ambassadors from countries that had just emerged from war. And they said, if we don't deal with governance issues, we're not going to make any progress on this.
Yeah.
And we'll walk away from it. So we're very thankful when the intellectual history of the Sustainable Development Goals is written, how they came together, that those are unsung heroes or heroines for what happened. It's also a way for us to be countering, frankly, China's walking around the world as if they are value free, when in fact they are saddling countries with a lot of debt. So it's particularly helpful, but it's helpful for us at home, and it ties very nicely to what happens at home to what happens overseas. Now, in terms of the process, this is the challenge. So that was the good news. We have a framework. We've agreed to it. It's negotiated. We don't have to open it up. The really tough bit is that the US government is not really set up to do work that binds domestic and international. The one exception I would say that I've experienced was as a representative of USAID on what was called the SPOG, the Senior Policy Organization Group to Combat Human Trafficking. In our efforts at combating this transnational issue, we recognize there's trafficking that happens in the US and overseas. And that was the only time I saw the Domestic Policy Council and the National Security Council come together. But it wasn't easy, and
Yeah.
they're different cultures. So there's a lot of culture shift that we're talking about. But the good news here is that we have Ambassador Rice leading the Domestic Policy Council. We have the National Security Advisor's Jake Sullivan, who's also spent a lot of time in the last decade looking at working families in the United States and how to make foreign policy meaningful to those families. So when I think about this summit, we're really talking about democracies deliver dignity and development and trying to knit those things at home. The process, I think, ought to be involving very public facing approaches. When we have certain kinds of convenings like the G7, oftentimes what governments will do is they'll anoint what they call Sherpas, point people who put together this agenda so that when the heads of state come in together, they've got it all worked out. This needs to be that, but on steroids, right? So we have a very public facing interaction. Ideally, I would say the Biden administration needs to go out to leaders across the United States and say, we want to be hearing from your communities what of a domestic reform agenda is important, right? But then there's a lot of work to be done internationally. And so there's work in collaboration with countries around the world. And this summit should be, as Ashely was saying, not just a government to government approach, lots of room for civil society, for mayors, for universities. A lot of the action, particularly on the SDGs, has happened well outside of capitals, well outside of the federal level. And there's a lot of citizen engagement, and that's exciting. For the agenda for the summit, we really think we think and we've heard from along the way during the campaign, but also from transition and then government officials, there's basically 3 or 4 baskets that we're looking at. So one is a domestic reform agenda, and that's not just us, but other democracies coming to the table. My guess is that for the United States, and again, this needs to be informed by conversations across this country, particularly with youth, that this is going to be about issues related to racial and social justice, economic inequality, education, health, and some kind of electoral reform, probably. There's also a need to elevate our collaboration on pushing back against authoritarianism. We need to do much better at that. And you saw over the weekend, or actually yesterday, Canada was leading. I think 57 countries have joined a sort of resolution condemning arbitrary detention.
Right.
And this is particularly important in countries like China or Russia, where they're detaining people arbitrarily. So that's an example of that kind of joint work that needs to be done. It needs to be very focused on corruption, very focused on disinformation, and we'll be getting to that in some other sessions. But there's also a need to kind of refresh our emergency response to human rights crises, and particularly a longer term focus on supporting people in exile. Freedom House came out with a very interesting report last week about the ability for these authoritarian countries to reach into exile communities wherever they are, including in this country and other democracies. So this work on exile needs to be really elevated. And then I would say we need some refreshed effort on supporting emerging democracies. We can't let that work. So this is really an in the round, right? It's
Right.
refreshing us at home, collaboration on the authoritarianism front, not forgetting the human rights defenders and figuring out 21st century ways of supporting them, but then also the emerging democracies. We also have a couple, I would categorize them as culture shifts that we've talked about. One is something we're calling the diplomacy of democracy, which really is about elevating for diplomats, wherever you're serving, the role of a US diplomat advancing democracy. You know, for Nicole, Ashely, myself, when you're serving in government, you know, we're kind of the champions for the democracy, human rights, governance piece, but oftentimes it's pushing a rock uphill. There are colleagues who are very well meaning, maybe in the best of times they get it, but they don't necessarily see this as their number one priority.
Yeah.
And we're saying this is, you gotta really step up the game. This has to be a really important element. But also those 21st century development challenges that Ashely was mentioning, including climate crisis and migration issues, anti-racism, transparency, corruption, et cetera. So we're talking about both having diplomats elevate democracy, understand also much more about the United States than they actually may do, so that they're able to talk about and learn lessons from other countries. Who's got some good practices on reducing inequality and being able to bring that back home? The organizations that would come to the summit, I think we're really looking for them to also have these 21st century models. So Ashely mentioned the Open Government Partnership. 21st century democracy is about participatory budgeting, having citizens be able to weigh in on that issue. So we want to, rather than the model of just having American NGOs going out working around the world, how do we bring communities in the US that are working on issues in the US to share lessons learned and learn things from colleagues in other countries? And the last thing I would say really has to do with, and I would be dereliction of duty as a Heinz faculty and staff member not to advance the idea that data-driven approaches are really critical to this. You know, a 21st century model really ought to have human-centered design, disaggregated data. What are the needs of the communities that you're working in? How do we help respond? How do we help make whatever work that we're doing much more effective and efficient in having that data drive our programming? And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Excellent, excellent. I see a couple comments or questions coming into the chat box. I would encourage other folks to start posting the questions that you may have. There's a lot that we've packed into these questions and answers. I'm going to turn to Ashely in a second to just ask one last question before we come to the student questions. But I would welcome people pulling out different threads of what you heard in Sarah and Ashely's responses and posing your questions. So Ashely, you've written quite a bit about COVID-19 and about racism, arguably two of the most pressing challenges we have right now in the United States, certainly, but globally, undoubtedly, and how they have challenged democracy. Can you just walk us through some of the arguments that you have put forward as how you see each of these threatening democracies and what you'll be watching for to see how democracy can emerge from these challenges?
Sure. Yeah, I think that COVID in particular, from a global perspective, really is kind of like going to be the next huge test for democracies in terms of how they're able to come out of it in a way that is respectful and preserves civil liberties and political freedoms, but also manages an effective response and minimizes corruption. It's kind of like all of the things to see how governments are going to be able to do that. And certainly in the U.S. and other places where you've had many places around the world have seen disproportionate impacts of COVID on communities of color, particularly Black communities. I mean, this is something that's not just impacted Black communities in the U.S. That has been a global phenomenon, because these tend to be marginalized communities and systemically marginalized communities across the globe. So how we are able to make this sort of an equitable response that that addresses those populations and their needs is also going to be something to be watched. But I would say COVID-19 globally has had enormous impacts on democracy, as governments have declared states of emergency, as they've banned public meetings, delayed elections, deployed technology for the purposes of tracking and monitoring citizens' COVID-19 status, but can also be deployed to monitor and track citizens for other more sinister purposes. Corruption. I think we're going to see massive amounts of resources put into various economies to stimulate the economy, and also to support the vaccine distribution and other public health measures. I mean, so the idea that we are going to be able to again mount a response to this huge public health and economic crisis in a way that demonstrates to citizens that we can do this without massive leakage, that we can do this in a way that restores public confidence in democratic governance, in a way that includes citizens in how those resources get allocated, et cetera. I think that's going to be the real test, and also the opportunity. And then the last thing I would just say is, especially when it comes to the U.S. and the spotlight that COVID really has placed on not just racial injustice in the criminal justice system, which of course we saw in the protests of last summer, but in terms of the spotlight that it's really placed also on sort of more broad systemic racism in our health system and elsewhere in our society, and the opportunity that from a democracy perspective that this really provides us and countries around the globe that have the same kinds of inequities, to use this opportunity to put that spotlight on these inequities and to put in place the policies now that are going to hopefully address them. So I see this as both the thing that's really put the spotlight on this, but also hopefully is an opportunity to integrate this work more fully into our overall democracy agenda.
Excellent, excellent. I do think that this will be the test that many will look to as to how democracies emerge, and to what extent are some of those restrictions that you outlined, will they be lifted, and how will democracies deliver? That's the question that we've been talking really about in these socioeconomic questions. Democracies delivering on what people want. COVID is one of the greatest tests.
Nicole, can I just build on something that Ashely said?
Please.
We're in the process of exploring a project that comes out of a very intense exercise that Brookings and Rockefeller ran, called the 17 Rooms, where I ran a conversation for Room 16, where we were very focused on the $12 trillion in COVID relief, and whether or not this amount of money is going to exacerbate inequalities or whether it's going to reduce them. So trying to scale it into something that is doable, we're looking at a handful of cities in the US, possibly Canada initially, and then scaling up going forward with partners overseas, where we're really asking that question. To what extent have the relief and recovery funds and programs had an impact on a variety of communities to make life better, reduce inequality and inequities, or have they had no impact, or have they exacerbated things? So this is a big challenge, but it's also a way of really making SDG 16 live, sing, make it relevant. We're calling it hashtag Just Recovery. And it's a question mark. And in some places there may be great examples, and in some places maybe not so much. So stay tuned, watch the space, and hopefully we'll have something to report back. And if you're interested in hearing more about it, I'm happy to talk offline.
Excellent. I look forward to reading it myself. There's a question from Raul about where do we see international organizations such as the United Nations in this conversation about democracy reforms, and then particularly the Summit for Democracy. Obviously, it's something which President Biden has put forward. I will change his question a little bit. Why not run by the UN? I have my own thoughts on this, but I'm very curious as to what our two experts say. How do we see this in the global body, but the global body that does not have membership criteria other than you are a country? So let me turn that over to you two. How do we see the role of the United Nations early in this question about democracy reform, and then the relationship to a summit for democracy?
So there are a number of UN convenings that are happening in 2021 that we can take full advantage of to help build out on the international side what it is that we want to get done at the Summit for Democracy. We need to do the same thing, trying to figure out what does the domestic calendar look like. So we've got a special session on corruption happening in June. Separately, there's a G7 meeting in the UK that's very relevant. Every summer, July, there's a high-level political forum where governments come together at the UN to report progress on the SDGs. There's UNGA, that'll be an opportunity. There's the big climate meeting in November in Glasgow. So the UN calendar affords a number of opportunities for the US and others to come together, but not have it run through the Secretariat. I think that generally you see it is this can be difficult enough. To run it through the UN Secretariat would be enormously cumbersome, and it's not clear to me what the outcome would look like. But taking advantage of the calendar is smart. I helped run the President's Refugee Summit in 2016. And typically what those kinds of meetings look like is the president sets an agenda. We in the interagency scramble to get countries to come and make commitments and deliver. It's always a struggle, frankly, at the UN to get civil society in the room. And it's very much a kind of top-down driven process. And that's not what we want. This is a very different kind of summit.
Ashely, do you want to jump in on that, or should we move to another question?
No, I think that Sarah hit the nail on the head. And just one quick thing is, I think that the UN is helpful as a convener. It's an opportunity to shine a light, and it creates these opportunities for the subgroups of people who care, of countries who care about a particular agenda, to come together and work on that agenda. And I think that's what Sarah's pointing to about the calendar, is it creates this opportunity to convene the like-mindeds and shine a light on it. And so I think that's the opportunity that the UN can provide in terms of these shared spaces and the high-level attention and the media attention. But I agree that it's not the forum for many of the debates about the summit. I don't know if any of you follow the summit literature. There's quite a bit of literature about the summit, and a lot of it gets dumbed down to who's going to come. And I think in the UN context, you have that compounded, right? Because it's a global body. And so the idea that, that who's going to come is the perennial question. So it's better left out of the formal system and left to the space, the convening space that the UN provides for like-mindeds.
Excellent. So there's a question specifically about Ethiopia. And from Absalom asking what can be done in these cases where you have internal strife, and how would some of these themes and the threads that you've been discussing really help countries deal with those domestic challenges? We've seen a lot of change in Ethiopia in the recent, I don't know if either of you are
well, Ashely
versed.
carried this portfolio for years, so I'm going to let Ashely respond.
Excellent.
You know, it's true. I mean, Ethiopia has had tremendous amounts of change since I left government a couple of years ago. But I think, you know, it's some of the points that Sarah has mentioned first about people who go into exile. I mean, if we are, you know, the types of violence and such that we're seeing in parts of Ethiopia has created lots of refugees, and I think you know, providing lifelines to folks who want to engage and want to be, not that Ethiopia is going to be reaching out, but I think sort of the idea that there's sort of a diaspora dimension for sort of democracy activists and supporters to be factored into you know, how we think about countries that are struggling with this internal kind of strife. But I think the other point that we are pointing to is that in terms of our alliances about engaging in Ethiopia, the United States has been very, at least up until a few weeks ago, not active in pushing for a solution in Ethiopia. And I think there's a lot to be gained from us working in partnership with allies on the continent, with the African Union and others, to try to sort of create, you know, some stability, and also to address the very, very horrific human rights violations and abuses that have taken place there over the last several months. So I think that we need to engage, and it's definitely the only way we are effective in a place like Ethiopia is certainly through our alliances.
Excellent, excellent. Let me turn, you mentioned it, Ashely, that many people in the summit chattering class are talking about who's invited and who's not invited. So let me merge a couple of questions and throw out, should the Biden administration deal with this question of who gets to attend, right? The UN is a body for everybody, a summit for democracies. Is that for everybody? Is that just for countries that are nominally democratic? And to the second point, which someone puts in the, which is also in the chat, is how do we define democracy? And for the purposes of this, and thank you, Margaret, for the question, do we have a narrower definition? Do we have a broader definition? Is it a self-definition that whoever wants to call themselves a democracy? So those two questions, and they're obviously interrelated, which is, how do we define democracy for the purpose of this summit? And then who will be there? Obviously, it's not the only issue, but it's also an issue. So whichever one of you or both of you would love to hear your thoughts.
This really has been, for whatever reason, people focus on the invite list. I guess it's, you know, why is that surprising? If you say you're going to throw a party, everybody wants to figure out who's going to be invited. But
well, if you throw a party, it's like if you throw a party of like the cool kids. It's not just throw a party and you're saying like, but who actually is the cool kid? Or right? So there's a definer to the party invitation.
So that's the problem with the word summit, because in many ways, this is really about a process and not a moment, right? So what we should be thinking about is a pivot for really, frankly, a decade. Particularly if we're using the SDG framework, we're looking at multi-year strategies where democracies are going to be delivering, where civil society is going to be holding democracies accountable, where there's follow-up and review. You can only come to this if you're making specific commitments along the lines of the baskets that we described. There are colleagues who've served in government who've been involved in summits who just get terrible headaches when they start thinking about this. I'm diplomatically or not, whether this is wise, I'm really coming to the table with a small number of countries. I'm definitely on the side that says this should be a small number of countries that have representative government that recognize that they are having challenges, that welcome free press, critical press, that are also very invested in the idea that there are shared international norms around democracy and human rights, right? So that they see it as part of a international effort to be supporting human rights defenders wherever they are, so that's not a question. And that really, that means that a Hungary or a Turkey, or frankly an India, would probably not in this first meeting want to come, because that they wouldn't subscribe to those issues. So starting small, also, let's not forget, we want a wide swath, ideally, of civil society to be also a part of this. And so that it's not just heads of state, but it's also that sort of vibrant group. Now, that is going to be, for some, controversial. And we have really, frankly, at this point, no idea how they're going to parse through this. We hear that there's a conversation between the go big and the go small camps inside. We as a task force do not take a position on this. I think there's some that feel very strongly it should be big, and there's some that feel strongly it should be small, and that no doubt there's some that are in the in-between camp. Ashely, you have thoughts on this?
Well, just to say that, because I think we want this to be not only a conversation among democracies about democracy, but between democracies and their own citizens, and the sort of domestic agenda that each of us needs to undertake, that, that could be in some way, the cost of entry in some ways, the sort of willingness to engage in this kind of dialogue with your own citizens and come to the table with some agreed upon set of reforms or issues that are going to be part of your own democracy support agenda. I think there are ways to think about how we encourage those who might participate to really do this kind of engagement on the domestic front, and that's sort of part of what we'll be talking about country to country on the democracy front. But I agree, it's something we don't get into. It's going to be I sympathize with those in government that are going to have to to make that decision.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you, Ashely, is sort of it's less of a who's on a shorter or a longer list, but who self-selects by having a high enough bar for the invitation, that by saying to get your ticket in is to actually engage your society in the hard conversations and commit to reform and commit to doing these things. If you do that, then sure, come on in. If not, and that will be a self-selecting process of honest countries who are honestly willing to wrestle with that.
Exactly.
Or frank countries. I mean, countries that are, this is hard work. It's very hard work. And recognizing that there's no cookie cutter answer, and that, you're willing to give voice.
Yeah.
It's not like Mr. Putin's going to want to show up at a meeting like this.
Yeah, I think the challenge will come. I think my preferred approach is to make the ticket in the door very, very hard to fulfill. I think the challenge will likely come for those countries who will window dress their way or will want to window dress their way. I have no doubt it may be Mr. Putin, with Russian government sponsored NGOs or Russian sponsored independent journalists to say, well, look, we've got these journalists and we've got these NGOs and we are engaging our civil society so greatly, and we can walk in the door just like Sweden or, any other.
I would look for, just knowing how Russia responds, I would look for some variant that the Russians might convene something out there with there might be a countering democracy summit at some point. So that'll be interesting to see what happens.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me turn to a question about, it's specifically directed at Sarah, about addressing economic inequality worldwide, which is such an important issue. Where does that funding come from? Particularly, Daniel doesn't say this, but I'll add my little asterisk to it, particularly in a time where we are facing a pandemic, and everyone in the world, not only in the United States, but certainly in the United States as well, will have the huge challenge of the economic response to vaccinations, to healthcare, and to economic recovery, much less many of these important, more systemic issues, which are not unrelated, but they certainly are distinct. Where does that come from, and what does that look like?
This is in some ways a parallel conversation to the size of the summit. People get very hung up on, for understandable reasons, on the cost. So the conversation about the SDGs has often been, who's going to finance this? My answer to this is, I don't actually think we have any choice. I mean, I think that when you look at the US government spending, what we're really talking about in part is a Dan knows that I'm a Russia specialist. I take very seriously the threat to national security that Russia poses, but I think that we have tremendous imbalances between our domestic spending and our defense spending, our diplomatic spending, our development spending. Number one. Number two, there's an enormous amount of capital out there. I just was looking at a list of 200 companies around the world that are actually very engaged in the SDGs. So I think that the issue is, how do we harness the enormous resources that are out there, including this 12 trillion that is going around the world for COVID response, and make it efficiently responding to this economic inequality? I just don't think in the 21st century that we have the luxury of pretending that this isn't something that we need to be addressing. And we need to unpack it. Are we talking about, and I think, frankly, the Biden administration is very focused on this, the ending child poverty and what that means in the longer term for economic recovery. So I think that there are really smart, creative ways at looking at this, and all hands on deck.
Yeah. Yep. And money can often be found when it is seen as a priority. I think the challenge with this is not singularly finding the money, it is making it a priority and understanding that many of today's pressing problems will be mitigated or will be solved in part by dealing with many of these systemic issues. It's just always hard to rally interest for the thing which is not the flavor of the day, or which is not a crisis in the moment, but rather these.
But this is a crisis. I mean, this is a once in a generation opportunity. He's going to put, it seems like there's going to be this enormous package that's going to go through. We've seen a lot of also community development organizations, cities across this country really pivoting to address these issues. So I sort of feel like we're in a terrible situation, but out of this terrible crisis, we can come away with a completely different understanding about what the health of our communities looks like.
Yes, yes. Let me turn to a question. I'll be interested in your answers, because Emily poses a great question, which I also have on my mind, which is, we've talked about the infrastructure externally, about US agencies that face internationally and the international infrastructure. I know both of you are internationally focused, but what does that infrastructure look like domestically to deal with some of these, of bringing in local and community voices? And how does that, in a country that is as large and diverse and spread out as the United States, what does that look like, since there's not one central place that all of that is coordinated?
Go ahead, Ashely. We're both in conversations about this all the time. It's really hard. Go, Ashely, you take the first cut.
Yeah, just Just really quickly, I think that that's a great question because, first of all, there's a huge divide between the domestic democracy reform community and the international democracy support community. So those two communities don't talk to each other. So that's one kind of need, is to have that cross-pollination. Then there's the sort of democracy, the domestic democracy support community. And by that, I mean people who worked on voting, election reforms and ballot initiatives and all of those things. And then there's this whole group of people who are working on sort of social justice, doing this sort of social justice, economic justice work as well domestically. Those communities don't talk to each other. So there's a lot of, I think, bridge building to be done with the sort of domestic social justice, economic justice, democracy support community domestically, and then also between all of those stakeholders and the internationally, the international facing groups that do this work overseas. And so to my knowledge, there isn't anybody, there's people trying to knit this together, but it hasn't come together yet. But I think there is a growing realization that these different communities need to talk, that there is this real strong linkage between the global facing work and the domestic facing work. And so I think that is starting to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Go ahead, Sarah.
This is, I think, among the most difficult issue. It's not about who gets invited, or, I mean, you can set criteria which will make it very obvious, at least on a country side, of who's going to show up. But I also think there are some lessons to be learned. And again, we go back to the Open Government Partnership. OGP has been running summits for 10 years in which civil society and governments come to the table with equal voice. And so in the conversations that Ashely and I are among, we've sort of suggested that the OGP guys who've been running these summits, what have you learned? What's the secret sauce? And I suspect it's like a lot of sauces. It's going to have a couple of very specific ingredients, and that there's no substitute. You're just going to have to start, right? It's going to be location, regionally by region, city by city, that it is up to all of us to be doing some of this work. The project I described earlier, we're looking at a handful of cities in which we're talking about bringing together a combination of community leaders who represent very diverse constituencies, plus colleagues from university, plus city government, maybe some private sector, so that you're getting a real cross-section youth to be able to start to listen and respond. But it's hard work, but it has to start happening. We need that domestic calendar built out the way we have the international one.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'm going to go to a question that Raul poses. I'm going to reframe it a tiny bit. What we're talking about in a lot of places, the importance of connecting different communities and working to put policies in place that deal with socioeconomic issues and the functioning of the system. One crucial element is this issue of citizen trust in their government. And one part of it is when democracy delivers what you want, right? That you actually have schools and healthcare and things like that. But another is just when the institutions seem to be functioning in service of the values of a democracy. And there has been unquestionably around the world and in the United States, erosion of that trust. I think many people are processing this last week of impeachment, of what that has looked like, how to process voting on party lines or not on party lines, all of those questions. How do all these processes that you're talking about, which will be important of delivering stuff, also deliver or cultivate this idea of trust, which is so hard to get our hands around, trust in society, because that's so fundamental to a democracy? Easy question for our remaining 2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think as much people are talking a lot about a commission to look at what happened on January 6th, I think that we need, on some level, a major societal project on this issue of trust. And it goes to the issue of disinformation and information that you trust, facts that you trust, as well as transparency and accountability on issues around corruption. So I see it as part of, again, a much longer term project, if you will. There's no easy answer. There's got to be some combination of civic education, understanding what works in other countries on this level, what used to work in this country. I mean, I think that there's an argument that we were better at this perhaps before than we are now. And, you know, having some people, having a collection of people really look at this and provide recommendations, it seems very, for the 21st century, it seems like a throwback, and yet it is really fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you guys have already heard from Working Group 1, the group that was working on the sort of nuts and bolts of okay, that's your working group, Nicole. But, I think one of the sort of conclusions from this question I would just, emphasize is that we are advocating for sort of, some new focus areas for our democracy agenda, but also that we have to maintain this cornerstone of the bread and butter of what democracy is. And, the checks and balances, the importance of independent institutions. I mean, I think we all recognize these are under threat by things like Sarah talked about: misinformation, corruption, authoritarianism. And so this bread and butter work has to go on. We have to continue to invest in it here as well as in our international facing work. But I think what we are hopefully making the case for in our task force and in this conversation is a broader look at the work that includes that core democracy work, but also integrates that more fully with our economic, social, and economic justice agendas, with our making democracy deliver in real ways that are tangible for improving people's lives, so that we're sort of, marrying those two while not forgetting the very intrinsic work of what democracy support is designed to do.
Excellent point. Excellent point. I wish we had 6 more hours or days or weeks to keep talking about this. Obviously, many of us will continue these conversations, but I just want to say thank you to you, Sarah, for your leadership on this series particularly, and then thank you to you and Ashely for both your time today and your contribution to the task force, which is really producing important recommendations, which I have no doubt will contribute to strengthening democracy at home and abroad. So thank you to both of you, and I look forward
Before we
to
lose
continuing
people,
our conversation.
Before we lose people, first of all, thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Ashely, not only for your time today, but for being such engaged and helpful colleagues in this journey, which is difficult, and which we've been on for quite a while. Just to say that Thursday, for those students that are registered, we're going to meet at 12 o'clock. We have a lot to talk about, not having met last week. And then next Tuesday, we're not meeting. CMU is taking a day in the middle of this pandemic to pause. So we as a public gathering will be meeting on Thursday, February 25th, when we'll be discussing disinformation and digital technology. And then we'll revert to Tuesday, March 2nd. So we will see everybody, hopefully, on Thursday, the 25th, and I'll see my students on this Thursday. Thank you so much, and be well. Stay safe.
Thank you all. Take